Episode 11, Kumite in Japan. At about this time, cage fighting emerged. In my experience, in America, martial arts has been always media-driven. When Bruce Lee came on the scene, everybody was kung fu fighting. When the Ninja Turtles appeared, ninjutsu dojos popped up on every street corner. The same with cage fighting. Royce Gracie wanted to promote his Brazilian jiu-jitsu. He selected his opponents for the first couple cage matches, and the karate guys really sucked. Jiu-jitsu had been studied in Japan for hundreds of years. Kano Jujiro, the founder of judo, was a jiu-jitsu practitioner. He reformed jiu-jitsu in a number of ways and made judo superior to it. One change he made was the incorporation of ukemi, or breakfall. Jiu-jitsu and judo are both lethal arts. There are, in fact, death throes. Sensei told me a story of a man suffering 19 broken bones by being thrown once on a sidewalk. Jiu-jitsu was dangerous to practice and injuries were common, often severe enough to end your ability to practice at all. That changed with Sensei Kano and ukemi. The art became much safer. Judo players didn't lose nearly as much time to injuries, and their longevity in the art increased dramatically. Sensei Kano was throwing his students on their heads well into his 70s. In 1886, the Japanese were looking for martial arts to teach their policemen. Judo challenged jiu-jitsu to 15 matches. Judo won 12 matches, drew 2, and lost 1. From that point on in Japan, jiu-jitsu was supplanted by judo. When Brazilian jiu-jitsu started to become popular, I called the cultural attaché at the Japanese embassy in New York City. I asked if they could recommend a jiu-jitsu dojo in Japan. I was told there were none, only judo dojos. I'm not bad-mouthing any martial art. I'm just telling you what the facts were at the time. There's no doubt that the cage fighters are some tough guys, but I don't see the art. As cage fighting became more popular, I asked my teachers what they thought about it. Neither of them thought much of it because they couldn't understand why it would take 15 minutes to finish a fight. To them, 15 seconds was a long time. When Sensei T was studying judo in Japan, he had the opportunity to go to a promotional tournament. If you could beat 10 people of your own rank, you would be promoted to the next belt. He entered the tournament as a first degree and left as a fourth degree. In this tournament, you stayed on the mat until you were defeated. One after another, he beat 30 other black belts. He didn't spend 15 minutes on each. When he had the fight with the firemen, one kick, one punch, one throw, and they were down and they were done. There's another aspect to keep in mind. The cage fighters are all relatively young guys. Being young, they haven't trained for that long. Someone who has trained for 10 years is not going to beat someone who's trained for 20. Whatever the older practitioner loses in speed, he's gained in timing and technique. Case in point. Even though Sensei T had been in America for years, he was still well known back in Japan. Our dojo was visited by many young Japanese champions who came to pay their respects for Sensei T. Everyone in the judo world knew of him. There was a young American Olympian. One of Sensei T's students was his teacher. He'd been on the U.S. team for 3 Olympics. He came to visit Sensei at the dojo. He had quite an attitude. Sensei didn't understand why, since the best he'd placed was 3rd. Sensei didn't know how anybody could be so cocky when they'd lost twice. The Olympian sparred with some of our players. He was rude and disrespectful. Sensei observed this from his desk and said, guess got to beat shit out the young champion. Sensei, who was 60 years old at the time, just spanked the guy. It was embarrassing. He made him look like a white belt. I understand the appeal of cage fighting to the public, but I don't see the same artistry as one hit, one kill. Sensei S's teacher, the founder of our karate style, had been teaching in his Kyoto dojo for 45 years. To mark this event, he held a tournament and invited Sensei S and his students. I was honored once again to be asked to be on the U.S. team, which was composed of only 12 competitors, 3 in each of the weight classes. Sensei had fielded students from his dojos from around the world. In preparation for this tournament, I would go every Thursday to train with Sensei and the other team members at his dojo in New Jersey. His dojo was really state-of-the-art. At one time, it had been a single-family home. The basement consisted of the training area and a cedar-lined shower/locker room. On the first floor was Sensei's office, a kitchen, and a dining room. On the second floor was a wet bar, pool table, big screen TV with surround sound, and a number of couches and coffee tables where we would chill after training. The attic had been transformed into a dormitory where his ushidashi, the in-house student, would live. The ushidashi would take care of the business of the dojo, pay the bills, and teach the kids classes. There were 3 or 4 beds in the attic, and international students would come to train with Sensei. As a rule, I would stay overnight on Thursdays and go back home on Friday morning. A month before our departure for Japan, 2 Japanese black belts came to Sensei's dojo. They had both visited previously. Miyamoto was a 7th degree black belt, and Samijiwa-san was a 6th degree. They had both come to train with Sensei S. In preparation for the tournament, we had practice matches. You won a match by gaining more points than your opponent in a 2-minute time period. An ippon was a full point that would be awarded for a technique that would be deemed a knockout or lead to the end of a fight. For example, a kick to the head, or if you swept your opponent to the ground and then delivered a finishing blow, were ippons. Any other good technique would be awarded wazari. Wazari was worth half a point. You could win the match by scoring 3 points made up of ippons and wazaris. Otherwise, the victory would go to whoever the most points before time ran out. Samijiwa, the 6th degree, had 3 fights with Sensei S's American students. They destroyed him, which spoke to the superiority of Sensei S's techniques. I asked him what it was like to score only 1 wazari in 3 fights against 2nd and 3rd degree black belts. He said he really wasn't disappointed because last time he had visited, he'd scored no points. Japanese culture has survived for a millennium, perhaps because they stress unity as opposed to diversity. They're a very conservative culture, and keeping their traditions have served them well. The country was founded in 660 BC, and is arguably the oldest country in the world, so I think they must be doing something right. In that year, the first emperor, Jimmu, ascended. He was a very special guy, being the descendant of Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and Susanoo, the storm god. 126 generations later, his offspring still sit on the chrysanthemum throne. Think about that. The Greek and Roman empires rise and fall. The Ottoman Empire comes and goes. So do the Franks, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, and scores of others, while Japan just keeps ticking on. The country is very orderly, and as well as being the oldest, is probably the politest society on the planet. That does not mean that they are without prejudice. I would suggest that they feel superior to everyone. A number of things contribute to this attitude. Throughout their history, their emperor was believed to be a deity. If a god told you to do something, wouldn't you obey? Another factor was the Japanese myth of invincibility that was not shattered until the Second World War. One thing to keep in mind was the Black Death of the 13th century shattered most of the world. 32 million died in China, but the plague never crossed the Sea of Japan. Compared to the Black Death, COVID-19 was a walk in the park. To date, the best guess is that worldwide COVID-19 killed 3 million people out of a population of almost 8 billion. In the 1300s, there were less than 500 million people on the planet, and the Black Death erased 30 to 50% of them. The same ratio today would not be 3 million, but between 2.4 and 4 billion. Another driver of Japanese invincibility was the kamikaze, the divine wind. In 1274 and again in 1281, the great Kublai Khan, whose empire stretched from China to Hungary, invaded Japan. On both occasions, the Mongols landed on Japanese soil and battles ensued, but in the end, both times typhoons wiped out the Mongols' fleet and stopped their advance, thanks to the divine wind. Besides Batu, the grandson of Genghis Khan, no country but Little Japan has ever defeated Russia. Napoleon couldn't do it. Hitler couldn't do it. If we hadn't developed the atomic bomb, I'm not sure what the outcome of the war in the Pacific would have been. At the end of the war, the Japanese said, "We didn't surrender. The war just stopped." Their culture is heavily influenced by the ideal of the samurai, the perfect warrior, fearless, unquestionably loyal, artistic, and ethical. Another cornerstone of the society is Buddhism. Their politeness is rooted in not bothering anyone. They respect personal space. They don't enjoy being hugged upon greeting. They do not talk loudly in public. They let other people speak without interruption. Most things in day-to-day life have a proper form, from making a cup of tea to tying an obi, a belt. How you hand someone an object, especially money. Everything has proper etiquette. Sensei T told me that to qualify as a Japanese policeman, they must hold a third-degree black belt in judo. They carry guns, but if they were to fire them, they would lose their jobs because they were expected to handle any situation without using their weapons. He told me a story that took place in his hometown in Hokkaido. He'd been training in Japan for some time and may have been 19 or 20 years old. He and a friend had gone down to the beach on their bicycles. Night had fallen, and they were headed back to Sensei's home. On the way, they were stopped by 3 policemen. The problem was Sensei's headlight on his bike didn't work. Sensei asked them to let him go and promised to have the light fixed the next day. The police declined, and an officer grabbed his shoulder. Over the years, I heard Sensei say repeatedly he didn't like to be touched. He pushed the officer away. Sensei said the trouble started when the officer fell down. The fight was on, and Sensei annihilated them. He rode home and awaited the consequences. The next day, he picked up the phone to find the prefect of police on the line. The prefect asked for Mr. T. Sensei wanted to know, junior or senior? The prefect said, junior. Sensei said, you're speaking to him. The prefect said he wanted him to come down to the police station immediately. Sensei expected the cops would beat the crap out of him, but he went down as requested. When he reported to the police office, the prefect asked, did you beat up 3 of my officers last night? Sensei said, yes. The prefect said, will you teach my officers? I will pay you. Sensei said it was great. They weren't very good, and he enjoyed making them scrub his back in the bathhouse after training. He was never bothered by the police in his hometown after that. While I was training with him, an incident occurred locally. A young man led police on a car chase. He was eventually stopped and surrounded by 9 police officers. I don't recall if he was armed, but I don't think he was. He was shot and killed by the police. Since he was incredulous, he said, what kind of men are these? Why are the police here such cowards? 9 of them, and they kill the kid? I don't know about you, but I think he had a point. I think it would be great if the police were proficient in martial arts. It would minimize their fear and make the streets safer for them as well as us. We flew out of JFK Airport in New York around 9 o'clock at night, and after 14 hours landed at Narita in Chiba, Japan. Before I cleared customs, I had problems with the police. The same thing happened in Milan, Italy, on a child rescue job. It must be my pheromones that trigger the cops at airports. I fell in line to clear customs, but when I got to the window, they asked me a question that I didn't have an answer to. To wit, what hotel are you staying in? I'd flown over with a team, but there had been no discussion about where we were staying. In my previous travels, I'd never been asked the question. Since I didn't know the answer, they wouldn't allow me to pass. I went and sat down. 2 policemen approached me and asked me why I wasn't in line. I told them I'd been in line and that I was with a group, but I didn't know where I was staying. They spoke to each other at length in Japanese. There was some laughing and head shaking, as I presume they talked about me, the dumb guy Gene, who didn't know where he was staying. They told me it was against the law not to have lodging. I just couldn't say the Hilton. They wanted a specific address. I was in a pickle. What would you do? I didn't see any familiar faces from my group. Because I'd been delayed, maybe they'd all clear customs by now. But with my usual luck, the U.S. Chief Instructor appeared with the address of the Quality Inn. After a 14-hour plane ride, we got on a bus for a 4-hour trip to Kyoto. When we arrived at Kyoto, we were met by a number of our founders' karate students. I believe there was one for each of us. There was no transportation. Apparently, they had come to walk with us when we went back to our hotel. Of course, we had our baggage. People had multiple pieces. I had a backpack and a garment bag. I was also encumbered by the team's VCR camera. The hotel was a mile away. Our Japanese guides were no help. They had no interest in carrying a bag. As we walked along under our loads, flanked by our Japanese escorts, the Baton Death March came to mind. I don't know why. Eventually, we arrived and settled into the Quality Inn. Including the Americans, 160 foreigners, all Sensei as students, had arrived. So far, Finland had been the best tournament because we all stayed in the same hotel. In Switzerland, we were divided into 3 different hotels, and you were always wandering around looking for people that you wanted to hang out with. Like Finland, in Japan, we all stayed at the same place, which made it easy to renew old acquaintances and make new ones. It was 3 days until the start of the tournament. We had training sessions in the morning and in the afternoon. We would have 10 days to tour the country after the tournament. The big day arrived, and to our surprise, 3,000 Japanese black belts had entered. It was going to be rough sledding. The divisions were huge. You'd needed to win 6 or 7 fights to medal. There were going to be so many matches that it was going to be a Sanbon Kumite, a 3-point fight. No wazares or half points. Every technique would be scored as a full point. The judging as the foreigners was atrocious. Gert, the South African, summed it up when he said, "I lost because I couldn't fight them all, my opponent and the judges." The American 5-time lightweight world champion punched his opponent in the stomach so hard that he landed on his butt and slid a couple feet across the floor. The ref said, "Torimasen," no point. It was bad. Nobody minds losing a fight when it's fair, but to work so hard and spend a ton of cash to get robbed, well, nobody was happy. Only the American chief instructor came first in his division. That evening, Sensei S called all the international students together, and he apologized profusely for the biased judging. I did all right. I finished 7th in my division. Anywhere in the top 10 in that tournament was pretty good. Still, there was no way I should have lost my last fight, but I couldn't fight them all either. Kyoto is the most visited tourist city in the world. In 2019, 88 million people came to visit the thousands of temples, castles, shrines, as well as the old town of Kyoto. The night after the tournament, the chief instructor of Norway and I worked our way through the old town eating. We started at a sushi bar. Except for small tekamaki-type rolls, where the nori seaweed is always on the outside, the Japanese don't have sushi rolls as we know them in America. They are an American invention started in the 60s, the first being the California roll. Needless to say, the sushi was great. Then we went to a little hole-in-the-wall place and had dried fish and noodles. We ate there and sampled their comestibles. I had no idea what I was eating, but I liked it. We moved on to another type of restaurant I'd never seen. This consisted of a large horseshoe-shaped bar where the customers were seated. The legs of the horseshoe abutted a perpendicular wall. In front of the wall, surrounded on 3 sides by the bar, knelt our chef, next to a small charcoal hibachi. On either side of her were containers of all kinds of food. All the food was visible. 20 diners could sit around the horseshoe. She was like a bartender. She scanned the table, a customer would catch her eye and order something. She would throw it on the grill, and when it was done, put it on a long-handled paddle, and never leaving her kneeling position, push the paddle out to the customer where he would take the food. The next day, all 160 foreign students went on a 10-day tour. We started in Kyoto. We went to Niju Castle, built in 1603 by Tokugawa Ieyasu, 17 years before the Mayflower's passengers said, "Let's call this Plymouth Rock." As a stonemason, I found it very impressive for a number of reasons. I noticed that because of earthquakes, they lay their stone walls in a herringbone pattern. In the West, we use what's called a running bond. Think of how bricks are laid, 1 brick over 2, 2 bricks over 1. Basically, you do the same thing with stone. The plane of the stone is horizontal. In Japan, they use the herringbone, which is, in essence, one row of stone laid at a 45-degree angle to the left, and the next course of stone above it is angled 45 degrees to the right. Unlike Western castles, the outside walls were heavily battered back. The stones were huge, the size of cars. To me, another point of interest was that the stone was dressed on the site as opposed to at the quarry. Consequently, all the stone chips were used for the roadways. It's called hardscrabble. The craftsmanship was superb, as it was in all the temples, shrines, and castles we visited. Our next stop was Kinkakuju. Kinkakuju, I love that word. It means the Golden Pavilion, perhaps the most famous shrine in all of Japan. It's a 3-story affair with the top 2 stories covered in gold leaf. 220 kilos of gold to be exact, with a value in today's prices of over $15 million. There's minimum security around it, most of it to keep people from taking pictures of it. How long do you think it would be until the gold was stripped off in any other place in the world? We went on to the Kiyomiza-dera. This temple was a very cool wooden structure that housed the footprints of Buddha in stone. At a balcony, spring water was fed through stone overhead channels. The channels were part of the roof structure. These channels fed a shallow pond. Meditators stood below it beneath their flow. Using long-handled dippers, you could catch the water to drink. By doing this, a wish might be granted. The other option was jumping off the 43-foot-high balcony, and if you survived, legend had it that your wish would be granted too. 234 jumps were recorded, and 85% of the jumpers survived, although there's no statistic about if their wishes were granted or not. The practice was prohibited in 1872, so even though I really wanted to, I was not allowed to jump. At that time, Kyoto had a large public works project. They were making more land. They got granite from an inland mountain and with miles of conveyor belt dumped it into the sea to make more land. It was so much more productive than using trucks. When we left Kyoto, we employed a tour guide named Masako, the same name as the current emperor's wife. She was shepherding 160 foreign guests. Masako had a telescopic metal pointer with an artificial red peony mounted on the top. She would use this to gather us around her. She did an extraordinary job. The bullet train stops at the station for only 10 to 20 seconds. She organized all of us to get on the train in that amount of time. She was very knowledgeable and a great asset on our tour. That's the thing about the Japanese. Failure is not an option. I'm quite knowledgeable in Japanese history, but I didn't ask Masako any obscure questions. I didn't want her to lose face and have to go home and, as Sensei T said, cut guts. We left Kyoto and went to Shirahama on the coast for the onsen, or hot springs that the town was famous for. As always, there's etiquette when using the onsen. It was customary that you wear a garment called a yukata. You could liken it to a cotton bathrobe / kimono. They are always predominantly blue in color. They come with an obi, a belt, and fall to mid-shin. It was not uncommon to see onsen visitors walking around town in their yukatas. It was a very relaxed time, soaking in the hot springs and lounging on the beach. Wish you were there. One night, we had a yukata dinner. I wound up sitting with the Norwegian team that night, and we enjoyed a great evening. The next day, we got on the bullet train for Tokyo. I'd never gone 200 miles an hour on the ground. At one point, we ran parallel to a big highway with 6 lanes in each direction. The cars that were going the same direction as we were appeared to be parked. The cars that were coming toward us were just a blur. Another bullet train passed us going the other way. The closing speed is 400 miles an hour, so as it passed, there was a shadow from the other train, and it lasted the blink of an eye. We played tourists, and it was a great experience. We went to the famous shopping district in Ginza, and I realized that there was nothing cheap enough that I could buy. We went to the Sensoa Temple in Tokyo. I was hanging with Chris, a black South African. The Japanese called him a Koko Gaijin. We went to the temple and got our fortunes read. They gave us a round cylinder about the size of a Pringles can. On the top of the can, there was an offset round hole. The can was filled with chopstick-sized sticks, like a toothpick dispenser. You would shake the can until one of these sticks protruded through the hole. The stick had a number on it. The Buddhist priest would take the stick, walk to a huge cabinet of small numbered drawers, mask the number on the stick with a drawer, and voila, your fortune. As I recall, for the most part, the fortunes were very dark, like, none of your children will survive. Your destiny is to live on rat milk cheese, and you have no lucky numbers. Thank goodness mine wasn't impactful enough for me to remember. As we walked away from the temple, there was a huge incense burner. The Buddhist believers would use their hands to pull the burning incense smoke toward them. They would endeavor to rub the smoke on affected parts of their bodies to cure their maladies. A traffic-free road led away from the temple. On either side were small shops. Chris and I walked a quarter mile of this shopping area and then turned around and came back down toward the temple. 100 feet from the incense burner, Chris went blind. He grabbed my shoulder as if I were guiding him. He mimicked the head position and body language of Ray Charles to a T. The area was quite crowded, and as we approached the brazier, Chris bumped into a couple of Japanese people. Japanese don't like that. They don't shake hands. They don't hug. And their personal space, as I say, is very important to them. Even before we reached the brazier, Chris was creating mayhem. Once we got to the brazier, Chris started using his hand to waft the incense smoke toward his face. Then he started to rub his eyes. You guessed it, a miracle occurred, and Chris could see again. The Japanese were mortified. At the same time, Chris is praising the Lord. He's on his knees. Oh my God, I can see. Pandemonium erupted. I told Chris, we got to get out of here. We don't want to be on the 6 o'clock news. I thought the prank was very disrespectful. At the same time, I had to admire Chris's brass. The next day, we went to Mount Fuji on a bus. The bus had a feature I'd never seen before, a beautiful young Japanese livery girl. She was dressed in a similar uniform to the driver. In Japan, the drivers, the taxi drivers, the bus drivers all wear white gloves. As far as I can tell, the only purpose of this young lady was to guide the driver when he backed the bus up. When we got to Mount Fuji, there was a construction project going on. They were building a stone wall. There were 3 laborers and a small mini excavator on the site, 2 women laborers and a man. Through Musako, I conveyed to the boss that I was a mason and would very much to lay some stone on Mount Fuji. The boss said sure, and I set 2 stones in a herringbone pattern on Mount Fuji. Yeah, those 2 are mine. When we got back to Tokyo that evening, Sensei S took us to a German Hofbrau. It was surreal, being surrounded by Japanese men in lederhosen and beer garden girls that struggled to fill their costumes' cups. Busty St. Pauli girls they weren't. An American and Swiss competitor had brought their families to the tournament. So that evening at the Hofbrau, there were 4 or 5 kids ages 7 through 10 with us. As evening wore on, they got a little fidgety and asked their parents if they could take a walk. Their parents deferred to Sensei S. So to be clear, we're talking about young kids taking a walk in the largest city in the world at 10 o'clock at night. Sensei said, no problem. The only thing out there that would hurt them would be foreigners. The kids took a walk, and we played tourists for a couple more days in Tokyo. We went to the top of the Sunshine Tower with its vast view of the city. The Americans found a McDonald's, and I admit to ordering a bigumaku. Overall, the food was great. Pickled fish for breakfast was certainly a treat, but all of us Yanks were really ready for a cheeseburger. Overall, I found Japanese a fascinating culture. It's so very different from ours in the West. The Japanese expect their citizens to play their part in keeping their country stable by honoring the traditions that have served them well for more than 2,500 years. I left Japan and went back home to do more stonework and teach karate. By this time, I had 3 children. The eldest 2 had started training at the dojo. In Japan, I renewed my acquaintances with the South Africans and was invited to visit. That winter, when I shut the quarry down, I flew to Cape Town, South Africa. Dear listener, if you have enjoyed this episode, please share it. A 5-star review on Spotify or wherever you listen would be greatly appreciated. You can follow me and my Mastiff, Drax the Destroyer, on the It's in the Blood Facebook page. Or you can send me an email at jesse.it'sintheblood@gmail.com. Thank you so much for your support.